Well, it's a scandal of multinational proportions, and top news on the U.S. mainstream media outlets is all reporting on it. Take a look.
A Fox News alert for you now. The head of the International Monetary Fund just arriving to a New York courtroom. He's set to be arraigned on sexual assault charges in New York City.
In court, the latest developments on the arrest of the head of the IMF on charges of rape.
Head of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, will be arraigned inside this Manhattan courthouse shortly. That is going to happen. A hotel housekeeper accuses Dominique Strauss-Kahn of attempted rape.
Well, it's taken a rape scandal for there to be any major attention paid to the International Monetary Fund in the U.S. Never mind the bank's involvement in the Greece, Ireland, and Portugal bailouts of late, or its criticism of policies over the years by scholars like Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz, and from countries who received the bank's quote-unquote help only to call it crippling. They may be the real victims of the IMF. Well, join me now to talk more about it is Paul Craig Roberts, an economist and former Assistant Treasury Secretary during the Reagan administration. Mr. Roberts, thanks so much for being with us. First, I'm just curious, when's the last time you can recall the IMF being, a top story on U.S. media news?
Well, I think, if not in the media, at least it's been on Washington's mind for two reasons. One, the current director, who's now been arrested, Strauss-Kahn, was a likely winner of the next French election, at least according to polls. And Washington much prefers its man Sarkozy. It's also on Washington's mind that the IMF recently announced, to Washington's great consternation, that within 5 years the Chinese economy will have surpassed the American economy. So even though ordinary people don't pay much attention to the IMF, Washington was paying attention. And apparently Strauss-Kahn was also paying attention to Joseph Stiglitz. And his policies were being noticed by the banks because Strauss-Kahn was advocating a return to regulation, to have the banks more carefully regulated so they couldn't produce such crises that poor people have to pay for. And this was also getting attention.
What are you alluding to? I mean, what is the connection between Washington's feelings on Strauss-Kahn and their concern over the IMF and this rape scandal?
He is now eliminated as a threat. And that always raises questions. You know, the prior threat to the banks was the New York governor, Eliot Spitzer. And he was taken out on a sex charge. And now we have the IMF director, and he's taken out on a sex charge. Whether it proves to be true or false, he's now out of the picture. And so this is a great relief to Washington and to the banks. You know, I've been in many New York hotels, and in hotels in other cities all over the world, and I have never had a maid come into the room unannounced, much less while I was in the shower.
It sounds like you don't buy this story. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we don't know. We'll never know. We weren't there. No one was there. There were two people there, so it's a he said, she said. And what generally happens in American prosecutions is that the defendant is forced into some kind of a plea in exchange for lesser punishment.
A couple of things I want to ask you real quickly so that we don't run out of time. I want to ask you, that analysis that you made that Washington and everybody, corporations maybe are breathing easier without Strauss-Kahn, in charge of the IMF at this very moment. People that have said that he was kind of changing course and moving away from some of the neoliberal policies that countries that had IMF loans that they complained about, that he was moving away from that. Do you really have confidence that the IMF was moving away from these policies and really adopting policies that were better for poor countries and not as good for corporations anymore?
Well, all I know for sure is that the banks were worried about that, and Washington was worried about that. And Joseph Stiglitz seemed to believe it. So the two of them apparently were talking, and we know what Stiglitz's position is on that. So I would think that otherwise, I believe Strauss-Kahn would have been protected in these charges, and nothing much would have come of them. Generally, someone who's serving well doesn't encounter difficulties. It's only people who become threats that encounter difficulties.
Well, there's people that have been embroiled in sex scandals in their careers, Bill Clinton, that sort of thing. I mean...
And he survived it.
Mm-hmm. We'll see what happens with Strauss-Kahn, but I want to talk a little bit about the things that have not been covered, having to do with the IMF, possible victims. You know, some would argue, activists, that the IMF and its pursuit of fiscal policies by the rich world has been devastating for poor countries that it has, quote unquote, helped. Do you agree with that?
Well, that's the general, yes, I think that's generally true. An IMF austerity program always makes the ordinary people pay the cost of adjustment. And the IMF austerity programs are really despised by the so-called developing world, by the peoples there, because they invariably bear the brunt of them. And they will, just as they are bearing today in Europe.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that, you know, I've reported on that in other countries, in Brazil, and seen some of that sentiment. So I'm curious why you don't think any of those stories ever get any play in the United States. You know, those bigger, more important, profound stories to much more people than one sex scandal.
Well, because they're not applied to the Americans, so they don't experience the policies, and because often the austerity that's forced upon these so-called developing countries is in order that the New York banks can be paid off. So you wouldn't find the American media taking the side of some foreign population against Wall Street or New York. So I think those are the two reasons. If the policies were applied to Americans and they had to go through one of these programs, which they may yet have to do, they would certainly pay attention to that. But it's not their pain. It's the pain somewhere else. So it's not a media story.
Not a media story, but we're making a media story right here. Thank you so much. That was Paul Craig Roberts, former Reagan administration official.